Well, thank you for joining us, really week 3 as we're in this series on Josiah. Today, we're talking about trusting in the right thing. One of the things that is interesting on the dollar bill, it says, "In God we trust." But in Proverbs, it says, "Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, trust God, and He will make your path straight." And so one of the things I'm aware of is there are things that each and every day are competing for your trust in God. And as I mentioned, I find that in life as a pastor for about 20 years, there are two things that people oftentimes put their trust in other than God. And it's not that people don't trust God. It's just that these things start to compete with God. No one's ever saying, "I don't completely trust in God." It's just that when you really look at what people are focused on, what people are worried about, where people's minds and thoughts go to, if we're honest, sometimes it doesn't always go to the things of God or the promises of God. It goes to things that are around us. And one of those things I just mentioned is money. In fact, if you've been around our church for a while, one of the things I mentioned is there's kind of 3 approaches to money. And the first one is this: what's mine is mine, and that's selfishness. That's the idea that I've earned it, I've done this. And then the other idea behind that is what's yours is mine. This is the idea of stealing. And so I'm just going to take things and not really work for them. But here's the other one, the biblical one that we're wanting, and it's stewardship. What's mine is God's, that I've been entrusted with that gift or that resource. And so we believe a lot in stewarding what God has entrusted us with. And one of the life hacks that my wife and I have journeyed in our marriage is actually around giving. And for years, I'm ashamed to say this, as a pastor, I didn't even fully trust God with our resources. And then over time, I started to realize God really can't get a hold of my whole heart and my whole life if He hasn't got a hold of my wallet. Because there are things that, if I'm honest, that security, peace, and trust don't just come from God. They come from the financial circumstances that I have in my bank account or what the future looks like. And so there are times when Steph and I were both prompted by God to give money we didn't have. And I can tell you one time, and I even mentioned this, that one time we gave, and we felt called to give a specific amount. Fast forward 2 weeks later in the mailbox, someone said they felt led to give us the same amount that we had given and tithed to God. And we just saw these little places where God began to show up. And what it taught us was this: we don't give so that we can receive. What it taught us was simply, we cannot outgive a generous God. And so when I believe that all that I have is God's, what that means is He can entrust me with more. And if my hands are like this, I can't be filled up with any more. I can't be entrusted with any more. But when I live open-handed with what resources I have, God has the ability to pour more and more. And I believe this, that you cannot outgive a holy and good God. And so money does compete with trust. But here's the other thing I find competes with trust. Not just money, is sometimes we can put our trust in people. And sometimes we can put our trust in spiritual leaders, political leaders. We can put our trust in our spouse or certain family members. I'll never forget, one of the things that God revealed to me several years ago was that I had a mentor who was really an idol to me. In many ways, I would think about what they thought of or their perspective or their opinions more than I would what God thought. Why do I tell you this? Because I'll never forget, we had this moment where we didn't see eye to eye on something, and there was a little bit of a disagreement, and then we had this almost falling out. And that was incredibly hard for me, not just because, yes, there was a strained relationship, but honestly, this mentor God had revealed shaped the way that I view God. In fact, I saw God through this mentor, and I would honestly try to get this mentor's approval more than I was God's. And God was revealing in this whole process, this wasn't just a mentor, it was an idol. Because an idol is when you make a good thing an ultimate thing. And suddenly this mentor's voice mattered more than God. I'll never forget, I started praying about this and realizing that I had put my hope and trust in another person. It's important to have community, but it's another thing to think that this person's voice or this person's thoughts or this person's opinions of you can become more prominent and important. And I never thought that could happen, especially with a mentor in the church. But it revealed to me that anything, even good things, can become idols. Now, you pray about it, but I even think with Abraham, one of the reasons that God called him to sacrifice his son, even though he didn't, was that his son had become an idol to him in that moment. A good thing had become an ultimate thing. A thing that was good was now competing for trust from God. And so this is what I found in my life, that there are certain people in our lives that we can become dependent on more than God. God has placed us with a group of people, but those people, when they replace God, that becomes an idol. And this had happened in my life. And I'll never forget, as I was thinking about this and praying and asking God to help me live for an audience of one. Because if you have people in your life right now that you are looking to them more than God, then you got to be honest about that. There are things that are competing for your trust. And I'll never forget, as God started to reveal this to me, it's like all of a sudden, in the midst of that, I started to seek God. I started to hear his voice more clearly. And the verse that I read one morning that God just put on my heart was from Isaiah chapter 8, verse 1. And it says this: "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up." And this is what God said to me: "In the year that your mentor died, you saw me high and lifted up." Because what I realized is again, I was more worried about a person. I was more worried about their opinion and their approval than I was the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And if that can happen to me in a church, it can also happen to you. Sometimes we can put pastors on a pedestal. I see this all the time. When a pastor falls, it's like the church completely falls away. Or a mentor in your life, if they fall away from God, or if they do something that hurts you, does that completely bankrupt your faith? Or what happens if your spouse does something or says something? If we're honest, there are people in our lives that while they reflect God, they cannot be God. And if you put your trust in anything other than God, it can affect you. So in the year that King Uzziah died, this group of people saw the Lord high and lifted up. And when money and when people and idols die in your life, what happens is it gives you the ability to hear God clearly. Money is not a bad thing. Relationships are a wonderful thing. That's why we're doing small groups and communities. But when those people or those resources that God have given you begin to compete with God, there's a point where we got to be honest. We have fallen in love with the blessings of God over the blesser, which is Jesus Christ. And that's why Paul says, "I count it all as rubbish," for one thing, to know Jesus. And so as we dive into Josiah, it's kind of getting back to the basics. What in your life right now is competing for trust in God? How are you dealing with money? You know, one of the things that you guys can discuss is, what is your approach with money? Some people, even as I speak about money, it can be a little bit of a touchy subject and you can get defensive. Others of you are very comfortable with this subject. But maybe even talk about how you are trusting God with your money. And then maybe have the honest discussion, is there anyone in your life that's competing for the approval that you have, or is really sort of directing your life? Or maybe said another way, is there anyone you go to in your life before God? And maybe talk about what that looks like to put God in his right place, to trust him over some of the things that might be competing. It's wonderful to have those relationships. But God tells us to seek him first. And anything in your life that is causing you to not seek him first is competing with God. And so part of the invitation of this Josiah series is to get back to the basics. And today is all about making sure we put our hope and our trust in the right thing, which is Jesus Christ.